A typical day for Richard Sides began around 7 in the morning. After a quick shower and a light breakfast, he laced up his shoes and prepared for his daily rounds. At the moment, Sides and Eckhart were juggling 3 separate renovation projects, each involving a patchwork of subcontractors and specialist teams. They liked to think everything ran like clockwork, that each step in every project clicked neatly into place. In reality, it was anything but that. Renovation, Sides had learned, was a deeply specialized process. No checklist could account for all the chaos. The real challenge wasn't in the blueprints or budgets. It was making sure every team showed up and stayed engaged with their piece of the puzzle. Practically speaking, this meant Sides left his house promptly by 8 a.m., without exception. His first stop was always the same, a drive-through coffee shop on his route. Caffeine in hand, he began his daily loop through the city, checking on each property. The fastest way to assess progress was simple. Drive by and look for work vans parked out front. If a site looked deserted, Sides would either call Eckhart to confirm which crew was scheduled or start dialing the teams himself. His first stop that morning was just around the corner from the coffee shop on Belmont Avenue. The house on Belmont, as they called it, still needed electrical work, plumbing, exterior paint, and interior flooring before it could hit the market. As he passed by, Sides spotted a plumber's van out front. So far, so good. Next, Sides drove the 3 miles to the city's University District, where he and Eckhart had purchased a small retro apartment complex with 12 units. The building was over 100 years old, but that didn't concern them. It was structurally sound, and that was enough. The real problem, once again, was what Sides half-jokingly called the 4 horsemen of renovation: electrical work, plumbing, exterior paint, and interior flooring. On top of that, the parking lot was a mess, largely due to the high crime rate around the university. Neither Eckhart nor Sides had any desire to become landlords, but if they couldn't flip the building for their target price, they were willing to consider it. Their backup plan involved adding a perimeter fence and exploring long-term rental options. Traffic in the University District was always a nightmare in the morning, but Sides was relieved to see that both the electricians and flooring crew were on site when he arrived. Finally, he headed 6 miles north to check on their last property, located in a lower-income neighborhood on the edge of the city. He was still annoyed that the city had chosen to install massive black speed bumps on every street, while failing to increase police patrols in the area. The streets themselves weren't especially dangerous. Break-ins and home invasions were rare. The real problem was concentrated around major intersections, particularly in the evenings, and especially in the parking lots of the neighborhood's dwindling number of convenience stores. This final property had technically been ready to sell for more than 2 months, but not a single interested buyer had come forward. At this point, Sides' daily stop was just a formality, to make sure the place hadn't burned down and that the lawn didn't need urgent attention. The real estate agent's miniature billboard still stood in the front yard. No photo, no email, just a name and a phone number. Sides crept past the house, slowing only enough to scan for signs of squatters before moving on. Eckhart still maintained an old office about 20 minutes from the north side property. Sometimes Sides would stop by after checking on their projects, but not today. Neither of them had any leads on their next move. Cash was tight, and they both knew they needed to sell one of their 3 properties before taking on another. They had already decided that buying another place on the north side would be a mistake. There had been zero interest in the one they already owned. The University District, once promising, had become prohibitively expensive, and neither man was willing to take out a loan for the few apartment buildings that remained on the market. Sides had more or less given up on finding anything affordable near his own home or near the Belmont property. For a while, they'd shifted their attention downtown. It had seemed like a sure thing to Sides, even if it stirred up old memories of the shooting and the long, painful months that followed. But there was no low-hanging fruit downtown either, and now they were back at square one. That morning, Sides decided his best shot was to drive through residential neighborhoods looking for burned-out lots. He tried for over 2 hours, circling block after block, but it led nowhere. Eventually, boredom crept in, followed by frustration. Just before noon, he gave up. He grabbed something quick at a drive-thru and made the long trip out to Eckhart's office. When he arrived, he spotted Eckhart's expensive SUV parked out front. Sides pulled his modest sedan into the space beside it and shut off the engine. The contrast between their cars always struck him. The vehicles said a lot about the men who drove them. He locked his car with a quick press of the fob and crossed the gravel parking lot toward the entrance. The front door was open. He stepped inside. The first room had been intended for a secretary, but they'd never hired one. There just wasn't enough business to justify it. A metal tanker-style desk sat in the center of the room, its edges worn and scuffed. Neither man had ever used it, but Sides looked at it every time he came in. It was a quiet reminder of what they had imagined this place could be and how far off that still felt. He shook the thought away, shut the door behind him, and headed down the carpeted hallway to Eckhart's office. "Everything all right?" Eckhart's voice echoed down the hallway as Sides approached. "Yeah," Sides replied, stepping into the doorway. "Everything's fine. There are multiple crews at the complex, and the plumber's van is still over at the Belmont house." As he spoke, his eyes swept across the office. Papers and folders lay scattered in uneven piles across the desk and filing cabinets, most of it irrelevant, outdated, or both. The brown paint on the walls was starting to peel in a few places, and yellow stains had begun to bloom on the ceiling tiles from water damage. The hallway carpet behind him looked like it hadn't been vacuumed in weeks. God only knows when it last was. "Brian, why the hell are we paying for this rat's nest? How much is it a month?" $850, Eckhart said without looking up. "What?" Sides snapped. He already knew the rent was somewhere in that ballpark, but hearing it out loud still irritated him. Eckhart barely reacted. They'd had this conversation before. Sure, the place looked like it was falling apart, but to Eckhart, it was necessary. He liked keeping his home free of clutter, and the office gave him space to store the endless piles of paperwork left over from his former life. More than that, he found the atmosphere oddly comforting. The peeling paint, the water-stained ceiling, the general sense of disrepair. It had a certain charm, a kind of motivational grit. There was a leather chair in the corner, meant for guests who never came. Today, Eckhart's tacky old briefcase sat in it like it owned the place. Sides walked over, set the briefcase on the floor, and dropped into the chair with a long, frustrated sigh. $850 is very reasonable, Eckhart said. Reasonable? Sides shot back. Yeah. How do you figure that? It's less than your rent. I wouldn't have rent any more if we could unload that awful house in that low-rent neighborhood, Sides snapped, his voice rising with irritation. All the more reason to keep it, Eckhart said, eyes down as he signed a check spread out on the desk before him. Sides glared, but Eckhart didn't notice. He continued with his task, sliding open a drawer to retrieve an envelope. Sides watched, puzzled, as Eckhart folded the check and tucked it inside, then spun the envelope around in his hands. It had an adhesive seal, but Eckhart ignored it. Instead, he reached for a small piece of tape and pressed it along the bottom edge of the flap. In quick succession, he taped a stamp onto the upper right corner and began handwriting the address. What is a good reason to keep it? Sides thought. Which house was he even talking about? He said nothing. Instead, he kept watching Eckhart's ritual, mechanical, practiced, oddly deliberate. Eckhart's whole appearance had always struck Sides as eccentric, maybe even theatrical. He looked like the cartoon version of what might happen if a sleazy used car salesman had given up the racket and reinvented himself as a televangelist hawking miracle oil. And yet, Sides had to admit, he was a little jealous. At 42, Eckhart didn't have a single gray hair. His jet black mane was always slicked back, frozen in place with whatever heavy-duty product he favored. Most mornings, he was clean-shaven. In another life, Sides thought, Eckhart might have made a decent model if only he'd taken better care of himself. His face and midsection had softened with time and indulgence, but not enough to stand out. A change in diet, a regular workout routine, and maybe a thick beard to cover some of the bloat. It wouldn't take much. But Eckhart never made the time. What struck most people about Eckhart, almost immediately, was his peculiar taste in clothing. For someone in his line of work, he was nearly always overdressed. His usual uniform was a blue suit, complete with a matching vest. Ties, coordinated socks, cufflinks, and polished dress shoes were non-negotiable. He wore 2 rings, one bearing his JD, the other a decorative piece he always kept on his right pinky. He technically needed glasses for reading or working at a computer, but he refused to wear them, insisting they ruined his image. On rare occasions, when the weather was unbearable or he felt like dressing down, he might swap the suit for a plain black t-shirt and a blazer. But those days were few and far between. "You know, if you're having money problems," Eckhart began, sealing the last envelope. "I don't have money problems," Sides cut in. "I didn't mean it like that. I was just saying." "I don't have money problems," Sides repeated, firmer this time. "We don't have money problems, Brian. We have a cash flow problem. And all I was suggesting is that maybe, when this lease comes up, we don't renew it. That's what, another $400 each in our pockets every month?" "What the hell are you going to do with $400? Eckhart asked, throwing his hands up for emphasis. "What am I going to do?" Sides echoed, his voice rising. "What am I going to do with $400? "Yeah," Eckhart shot back. "I could do a lot with $400, Brian. But that's not even the point. The point is, it's our money, and we're throwing it away on this dilapidated dump that should have been condemned 5 years ago." He gestured around the room. "Honestly, if we were in the market for another commercial space, is this the one you'd pick?" Eckhart leaned back in his chair, silent, thinking it over. "I would. If I could get a client to move in here for $850 a month," Eckhart said with a smirk. "Oh, you're such an ass," Sides snapped, grabbing one of Eckhart's files and hurling it at him. The folder burst open mid-air, scattering papers across the office. Eckhart threw himself into a theatrical dodge, arms flailing like a cartoon villain under attack. He was laughing as Sides turned and stormed out of the room. Sides had only made it a couple of steps down the hallway when Eckhart called after him. Wait! Richard, come back!" "What?" Sides barked from the hall. "Come back, please, I'm sorry." "It's fine," Sides called back, unmoved. "Wait, Richard?" Eckhart called out. Sides could hear him getting up from behind the desk. "Richard, wait. I hear you, and I think I've got a potential solution to our problem. Come back, please." Sides turned and walked back toward the office just as Eckhart appeared in the doorway. Without a word, Eckhart stepped over the scattered papers and returned to his side of the desk. Sides followed him in and immediately knelt to begin gathering the mess. One by one, he collected the loose pages, tapping them into alignment against his palm until the entire stack was neatly squared. Eckhart watched quietly as Sides jogged the pages back into order and slipped them into the folder. When Sides handed it back, Eckhart smiled, just shy of a smirk. "Thank you," Eckhart mouthed silently, placing the folder on top of another without looking at it. That's when Sides realized. The folder and everything inside it had no real importance. He dropped back into the room's only other chair and let out a deep sigh. Across the desk, Eckhart answered with a long sigh of his own. For a moment, the room was quiet. The tension started to fade. Sides could feel his mood leveling out, returning to something like normal. But the stillness didn't last. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the subtle change in Eckhart's posture. The silence was just a pause before the pitch. Sides didn't need to hear the words to know what was coming. He could feel the sales job winding up. "So," Eckhart said, leaning forward slightly, "I may have a solution to our so-called cash flow problem." "Cut it, Brian. Just tell me what you want us to do," Sides replied, his voice flat. Eckhart smirked, rolling his eyes. "Have you ever heard of Francis and Maria Silva?" "Should I?" Sides shot back without hesitation. Eckhart winced. "Maybe," he said, frowning. Sides could tell he was being too combative. He sat up straighter in the chair, cleared his throat, and offered a small gesture of goodwill. "Sorry," he said, adjusting himself again. "Tell me about Francis and Maria Silva." "Well, I thought you might have heard of them," Eckhart said. "Do you remember that place, Silvas? It was that medium-sized grocery store tucked away near the university district. You remember? They used to be everywhere, and then one day they all turned into something else." "Yeah, I remember those," Sides said, a bit of enthusiasm creeping into his voice. He did remember. As a boy, Silvas had been the grocery store his grandparents always took him to. He spent most of his summers with them while his parents worked full-time, and Silvas became one of those small but sacred places in his childhood memory. His grandfather had a habit of letting him pick out cookies and cakes, ones he couldn't find anywhere else. To Sides, Silvas wasn't just a store. It was an entire season of his life, filled with warmth and sugar and quiet rituals. As he grew older and spent less time with his grandparents, the visits stopped. He remembered one summer afternoon as a teenager, deciding on a whim to walk the 3 miles from his house to the Silvas near their old neighborhood, only to find the doors locked and a new sign hanging above the entrance. Coming soon. A different chain, a different world. "Right," Eckhart said, snapping Sides out of his memory. "Those stores were owned by the family of Francis Silva before they sold the chain." "Really?" Sides asked, eyebrows lifting. His interest was genuine now. "Yeah. What you probably didn't know is that the chain was sold off well before you or I ever set foot in one. Mid to late 80s, I think. But the name stayed the same for years afterward." "Is that so?" Sides remarked. "The Silvas were completely out of the grocery game," Eckhart continued. "And their payout? Supposedly massive, hundreds of millions of dollars depending on who you ask." "Hundreds of millions?" Sides repeated. "Yes." "So what happened? Let me guess. Francis Silva squandered it all?" "Far from it," Eckhart said. "Francis didn't even inherit his father's portfolio until just before the turn of the century." "Okay, so what happened?" "Well, he got out of the dot-com bubble right before it burst. Perfect timing. He was even investigated for insider trading, but that went nowhere. Turns out he'd been slowly converting his holdings into real estate for years. It just looked suspicious because his timing was so good." "Lucky, I guess," Sides muttered. "That's what I thought too," Eckhart said. "But Francis lost a significant chunk of the family wealth when the housing market collapsed. A few of the companies he was heavily invested in went under. They had to liquidate a lot of the portfolio, sold off properties at huge discounts." "So his luck ran out," Sides said with a sigh, shrugging it off. "Maybe, maybe not," Eckhart replied, mirroring the shrug. "So he lost a fortune. What's the deal with the Silvas now? Why are they suddenly on our radar?" "Ah," Eckhart said, raising a finger. "They want to talk about their son. What's wrong with him?" "Well, for starters, he's dead." "Dear God," Sides blurted, caught completely off guard. "How the hell did that happen?" "That's the problem. We don't really know," Eckhart said. "They reached out through one of my sources. The homicide squad's pretty perplexed. They don't even know where to start. And some folks at the coroner's office aren't convinced it's murder at all. They're pushing to reclassify it as either undetermined or accidental. What? Sides shot back, eyebrows raised. It doesn't make any sense. It does, Eckhart replied, his tone cooling. If you've heard what I've heard. That stopped Sides cold. He shifted in his seat, suddenly alert. The conversation had taken on a weight he hadn't expected. Sides had seen more than his share of bodies during his time on the force, most of them clear homicides or the occasional grim find during a routine wellness check. He didn't know anyone at the coroner's office personally, but he was familiar with their work. Thorough, quiet, conservative with their conclusions. In his entire career, he could only recall one case where the coroner's office changed a cause of death from suicide to undetermined. A man had been found dead, gunshot wound to the chest, surrounded by firearm cleaning supplies. The scene could have gone either way. Some called it an accident. The insurance company called it a staged suicide, arguing that the cleaning materials were a ploy to avoid voiding the life insurance payout. Sides never found out how that one ended. "What have you heard?" Sides asked, his voice quieter now. "I've got a source at the coroner's office," Eckhart began. "They said it looked like he was torn apart by some kind of wild animal. There were clear claw and bite marks across his chest and arms, deep ones, like whatever killed him was on top of him, and he tried to push it off." Eckhart raised his own arms, mimicking the defensive posture, palms out, pushing away from his chest as if wrestling something unseen and feral. "A wild animal?" Sides repeated, skeptical. "In the city?" "That's what I thought too," Eckhart said, nodding. "We'd have heard if something escaped from the zoo, and they found the body too far into the city limits for it to be a bear or anything like that." "Bear attack?" Sides repeated, incredulous. "When's the last time you heard about a bear attack anywhere near here? There probably hasn't been one in this county or any nearby for decades." "Bear attack, lion attack, who knows?" Eckhart said, throwing up a hand. "But I'm with you. It doesn't add up." "You think your source might be jerking your chain, trying to get a rise out of you?" "Not at all. And for the record, I double-checked," Eckhart replied. "The rumor mill's already running hot. I'd say it's working overtime. More than one person has confirmed that the marks are there. Claws, teeth, the whole thing." He leaned back in his chair, looking annoyed. "The coroner's office is doing everything they can to keep it contained. 10 years ago, I'd already have the photos. But now, with the new security protocols, not a chance. Only way to get them would be for my source to break into the supervisor's office. And that's not happening. They'd be fired for sure. Maybe even arrested." He shrugged. "So no photos, not this time." "So, the Silvas?" Sides asked, steering the conversation back on track. "Yes," Eckhart replied, suddenly looking re-energized. "They've reached out. They want to talk." "To us?" "To us," Eckhart confirmed. Sides frowned. "What for? If everything's locked down with your sources, I'm not sure we can even do anything." Eckhart cringed and waved a hand dismissively. Then he leaned back, folding his arms behind his head and scratching absently at the base of his skull. His eyes drifted to the water-stained ceiling tile as he took a long breath. "They're convinced the department isn't taking the case seriously," he said. "They think it's because of their son's past. He had a history of drug abuse. They want us to look into it, scrub the case and see if there's anything the police missed or chose to overlook." "Drug abuse?" Sides repeated, his voice tightening. He almost recoiled. "Yes," Eckhart said, suddenly leaning forward, eyes sharp. "Richard, listen, they've promised 6 figures for both of us under the table." Sides' eyes lit up. Even at the low end, 6 figures would clear up nearly all the problems they were dealing with. He was intrigued, genuinely tempted, and gave the idea serious thought. Under the table was technically illegal. But there were ways around that. Expenses could be paid in cash. That alone would make their remaining property deals look far more profitable on paper. The cash could serve as a cushion, preserving the appearance of legitimate income while easing their financial strain. So many possibilities. As long as no one ever looked too closely, it could work. Of course, that all depended on one key variable, the Silvas being satisfied with their services. And that was the catch. No one drops 6 figures for this kind of work unless they're asking for something, without actually asking. Eckhart broke the silence. "Richard," he said, "if you don't want the cash, Silva also said he could cut us into a deal, one with a guaranteed payoff, taxed at 15%. "An inside deal?" Sides snapped. "What good is that if we end up on the inside?" "That won't happen," Eckhart said quickly. "We'd short a deal he's planning to tank on purpose. It's a one-time offer, clean and quiet." Sides shook his head. "Let's not worry about that right now," he said. "Tell me what you know about the case. Let's figure out if we can actually help them first." He leaned forward slightly, his tone steady. "We can't bring their son back from the grave, so what exactly do they want to know?" Eckhart nodded in agreement but didn't respond right away. Instead, he began rustling through a stack of papers on his desk, pulling a massive pile of loose documents and folders into his lap as he leaned back in his chair. Sides watched silently as Eckhart sifted through them, pulling one paper here, another there, gradually reshuffling them into some kind of order. Eventually, he slid a small stack into an empty folder, then returned the rest to the teetering pile atop his desk. He began examining each selected page one at a time. Eckhart had always guarded his sources closely. Sides had a good idea who a few of them were, though he understood their motives varied. Some were in it for cash, plain and simple. Others felt blocked by the city's politics or burdened by red tape. They saw Eckhart as someone who could maneuver where they couldn't. Sometimes that meant forcing suspected criminals into the open, drawing police attention in a way that created just enough noise for the press to notice. "Here it is," Eckhart finally said, lifting a single document. Sides sat forward slightly as Eckhart scanned the page. "Let's see. His name was Alfonso Silva. 27 years old, unemployed in the traditional sense. His parents last spoke to him on a Sunday, then lost contact. They say he'd been spending most of his time with a religious community off Lowland Avenue. Calls themselves the adherents of the divine winds." Sides raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Apparently, he'd been involved with them for about 2 years. The Silvas knew about it and didn't object. They said he struggled with drugs and alcohol in the past, at least 2 stays in rehab. But around the time he joined this group, he got clean. Sides absorbed the information as Eckhart rattled off his notes in his usual matter-of-fact tone. For all his years in law, Eckhart had never been much of a speaker. He lacked the natural ease that came with authenticity, whether in person or in front of a crowd. Sides had always noticed this. Eckhart's real gift lay in gathering and organizing information, not in interpreting it. Knowledge was another thing entirely. He wasn't stupid, not by any stretch, but he didn't always connect the dots. Back in his legal days, Eckhart's strategy had been simple: overwhelm the opposition with a flood of facts and let them figure out how the pieces fit together. It spared him the work of crafting a narrative and gave him a strange kind of leverage. When he finally did mention a settlement number, usually one well below the opposing side's breaking point, they jumped on it. He often left money on the table, but he didn't care. His volume of cases and reputation kept the fees rolling in. That tactic, however, didn't always translate to serious investigative work. Sides knew that all too well. Still, He listened as Eckhart continued cataloging details about the Silvas and their troubled youngest son. He mentioned how the family's wealth had ballooned through early dot-com investments before shifting heavily into real estate. Francis Silva had even funneled a portion of their fortune into firms that supplied weapons during the Iraq War. The money had flowed until the 2008 crash hit, and the Silvas fell out of the billionaires' club. Alfonso had been just a teenager when it happened. He'd never wanted for anything, but according to Eckhart's notes, he'd grown distant from his parents after learning about their involvement in arms manufacturing. That discovery left a lasting mark on him. The rift deepened over time and never fully healed. By the time Eckhart finished, Sides had made up his mind. The potential payout was worth the risk. Besides, they were deadlocked on all their property deals. Nothing was moving, and likely wouldn't for weeks. If they could dig up anything useful for the Silvas, they'd earn their money and blast through the financial logjam from a distance. It was exactly the kind of boost they needed. Sides hoped this would be the last case they ever took. He wanted to close the books on this side of the business and finally shut down the dilapidated heap of drywall and mildew. Eckhart insisted on calling an office. They could run everything from home. If Eckhart still wanted the place, he could pay for it out of his cut of the Silva payout. Sides was still weighing all of this as they left the office and drove across town.